even closer economic ties between China and African nations, but the U.S., under President Donald Trump, is taking a very different approach. Let's go back to Owen Fairclough, his interview with that Kenya-based economic analyst David Owiro. This time he began by asking him which African countries need China's investment the most.
Countries have very unique and differentiated priorities. So, for instance, you have a country such as Kenya, where already they have a lot of pressures on their debt management, and China already indeed is supporting to a large extent the infrastructure projects for developing the railways, the key railway infrastructure in the country, together with a few roads and ports. And so such a country, perhaps for the future, already it's given the fiscal policy space that exists, might require less than, say, a smaller country such as Rwanda, which is largely landlocked and is keen to develop infrastructure that connects it to the region.
Certainly the railway that China built in your country, in Kenya, that was one of China's signature infrastructure projects. But I'm glad you mentioned debt, because we're seeing China having to defend more and more criticism that it's saddling many countries with debt. You mentioned ports in Djibouti. China is investing in the port there. There's concern, specifically in Djibouti, that China is going to leave this country with huge amounts of debt that it can't repay. President Xi Jinping did talk about this back in September at the China-Africa Cooperation Forum. Let's listen to President Xi Jinping for a moment.
China will always be a good friend, good partner, and good brother of Africa. No one can destroy the great unity of the Chinese and African peoples.
What do you make of that? President Xi Jinping has said that China will write down some debt in some of the countries it's investing in, and there'll be no more what he called vanity projects.
We have to remember that this support is actually coming to meet needs and priorities that have been articulated by these governments. I think China is also realizing that there are some cases where their support has not been impactful. And the reasons for those, as President Xi mentioned, are that, in some cases, these monies have gone towards investments in so-called vanity projects. So projects for which basically are not priority projects, even in the view and perspective of the receiving countries. And so, for me, that is the interesting part of the discussion that we need to have. For me, it points to the fact that receiving nations, depending with their own governance frameworks, have to have internal discussions within their governments and within their populations to not only identify their priority projects and have goodwill and population support.
It gets complicated, doesn't it, when we bring the United States into this? Because there are geopolitical considerations to think about as well. The US, a bit late in the day, but at least has, the Trump administration just unveiled its Africa strategy, putting very much advancing US interests at the top of that agenda. Let's listen to US President Donald Trump's National Security Advisor, John Bolton, unveiling that Africa strategy.
The predatory practices pursued by China and Russia stunt economic growth in Africa, threaten the financial independence of African nations, inhibit opportunities for U.S. investment, interfere with U.S. military operations, and pose a significant threat to U.S. national security interests.
He says that the U.S. won't offer any more aid without accountability. He thinks the U.S. approach is different, that there's this sense of transparency and accountability, which he thinks that China and Russia don't have. What do you say to that?
China is very clear that they come to the aid table from a mutual respect point of view, and they look at Africa as its brothers. In that view, they offer aid and support without any conditionalities. Because conditionalities have in the past constrained Africa because primarily the aid that it received had a lot of conditionalities, and therefore most of the countries did not receive that aid, and even in cases where it received it, the aid was not going towards its key priority areas of investment that it needed to achieve its industrialization. And so the contrast that we see is that the Americans' stance is one of advancing their own interest first. And so this basically is much more of we are seeing much more of what has been done in the past And we all know how that has gone and the results of that. Africa hasn't developed. Africa has remained largely underdeveloped, and we haven't had a partner, apart from now China, who can work hand in hand with Africa to address Africa's most needful needs and priorities.